Greetings. My name is Jose Bañuelos, and I'm here with my partner Heather Gonzago. We are both product engineers for the ArcGIS API for JavaScript, and we are pleased to welcome you to our presentation for getting started with web development and the ArcGIS API for JavaScript. This presentation is geared towards those who are new to working with the API or those who have started working with it but are still learning some of the fundamentals. Of course, this does not mean that someone with a little more experience with the API is not welcome. Everyone is welcome because we will be demonstrating some neat features of the API, and additionally, we will be building out a standalone application piece by piece throughout our demos. Our goal is to show how to get started from having no experience with the ArcGIS API for JavaScript and end up with an application we all work together to build while learning some of the fundamentals on the way. The slides of this presentation and demo applications will all be available here, so don't sweat it if you feel like you missed some information. It happens, and you can always just go back through the presentation and source code we provide at your own time. In the agenda for today, we will take you through the initial setup of the API. We will walk you through the first steps of adding your first map to your web application. We will also talk about the new API keys that were added in our recent release to access some cool new base maps. We will then add a layer to our map, followed by adding a couple widgets to our application, so you will get some practice on that as well. We will then add a renderer to the data to help visualize the data in the layer more uniquely. We will introduce the concept of client-side filtering and show an example of this by adding this feature to our application. Finally, we will take advantage of another widget, the feature table widget, to give our application a very useful feature. I know we have a lot to cover, so let's go ahead and get started. Before we dive into the concepts and code, I would first like to take you through a brief overview of your best resource and new best friend, the ArcGIS API for JavaScript documentation. So let me go ahead and introduce you to it. You will learn to love it, and no matter how much experience you have, you will be using this resource. The documentation has the resources needed for getting started, from the Get Started page and the Install and Setup, which walk you through your initial setup with the JavaScript API, which we will do together in our presentation. There's also a tutorial section where there are examples that walk you step by step through utilizing and adding some features to your application from scratch. Here we have the API reference where we can see all the properties, methods, and events that are available for each class we use. For instance, let's take a look at the map classes properties that we can use, base map property, and the layers property, which we will be using in our demos. We can also take a look at some of the methods as well. My personal favorite page is the sample code page, where you have access to several sample applications which highlight the features of the API. There's pretty much a sample app for every feature in the API. For example, let's check out the intro to map view sample, which we see here. So these samples contain a sandbox, so you can manually test some code directly on the site before you add the code to your application as well. So for instance, let's go ahead and change the base map property value from topographical vector to a dark gray base map. I'm going to change the centering on the map view. Let's go to these coordinates. We will click refresh, and we will instantaneously see those changes directly on the map. So this is a cool tool that I personally like to use to test out some small features or code that I want to test out directly on the sandbox before I add it directly onto my applications. So now let's pass it along to my partner, Heather, where she will take us through the initial setup with the JavaScript API.
Thanks, Jose. So my name is Heather. I'm also a product engineer here on the JavaScript API team. Next, we're going to talk a bit about the developer setup that you're going to want to work with, or trying to determine which IDE would be best for you. Some examples of an IDE are things like Atom, Sublime, Visual Studio Code. It's really just important to pick the one that you're most comfortable with, mainly because it's going to be where you're going to be spending most of your development time. I personally use Visual Studio Code mainly because I like the easy integration that it has with GitHub, and I find that the UI is it's a little bit more user-friendly and it's just easier for me to understand. There's a little nifty page if you're so inclined. I have this linked here. It's basically just what are the best JavaScript IDEs or editors. And again, it's just, I'm assuming it's polling someone somewhere. So it tells you the pricing and so forth. So just a little something to look into if you're so inclined. All right, so another thing that you're going to want to get familiarized with is our JavaScript API resources, the GitHub repository that we have. So in this repository is basically just a helpful collection of resources that you can use to view, like if you need to get the TypeScript definition files, if you're looking to do maybe some custom builds of the API, maybe if you are looking to work with, in this case, we have a little callback that you can use, an HTML file that you can use if you're working with OAuth. But it's just basically just another a set of resources that you as a developer can use to try to make your life a little bit easier as well. I'm not going to go into all the details on this, but there is a lot of good documentation, and the README files do go into specifics on what you can do or what you would need to have and work with to get these running on your end. Okay, so next, we actually have to get the API. There's a couple different ways to do this. I'm going to go ahead and pull up the page in our SDK. This is the first way that you're going to get used to get the API, basically, is you're going to work with using the CDN. So we have this page within our SDK for installation and setting up the API. If you're brand new to everything, you're probably going to go directly to the AMD modules via the ArcGIS CDN. Basically, all you need to do in this case is just copy and paste a link to our main CSS file and to a reference to our latest. In this case, we are currently on 4.18, soon to be releasing 4.19. You can go ahead and just point to whichever version it is that you need, and we continuously have those running on our side. As long as you have an internet connection and you can access this, you have access then to our API. The next option that you can use is if you wanted to use NPM to run custom builds, whether that's to use if you're going to be working with AMD modules or whether if you're going to be working with ES modules. Our ES modules is a relatively newer option. If you are interested in that, basically I would just point you back to that resources GitHub repo that I just talked about in the previous slide, and it discusses that and the steps that you need to take to get that up and running. We also have a section if you needed to work with AMD modules as well via NPM. We can also, again, this is just another option is if you wanted to work with ES modules using the CDN. Again, this generally isn't something right now that we would recommend. Just like it mentions here, it's really just if you're going to be working with development and prototyping. And then lastly, if you wanted to, or if you need to, I should say, you can download the AMD modules for our API, and you can host them locally. Excuse me, you can host them locally on your end on a server, an accessible server. Many times you'll see this in particular instances. Maybe let's say if you're in a secure environment and you may not have the best internet access, limited internet access, or maybe even no internet access, or outside internet access, I should say, maybe. In this particular case, downloading and hosting the modules would be the the scenario that you would want to take. All right, so I mentioned in the previous slide that you can go ahead and copy and paste a reference to the CSS location for our when working with our API. There are a couple different options as well when it comes to which CSS it is that you may or how you want to work with your CSS. We have links here within our development or our developer SDK that talks about specifically about styling and some of the things that you can do if you want to change or work with updating or modifying how your styles actually display within your applications. So by default, you can just get the main CSS. So as I showed you in the previous slide and also in this one, if you reference the main.css, that's going to give you everything. So you've got reference to all of it. You may not need that. And if that's the case, you can create your own custom CSS using Sass. We do have a reference to that and some examples as well within our styling section within the SDK or on the developer side. In addition to the customizing the CSS using Sass, you can also go and set your CSS to be a specific theme. Usually what you'll notice the most, at least with our samples that we have on within our site, is you're going to notice a lot of light or dark by default. So if you go in and you reference main.css, it's going to reference the light CSS. You can change it to a dark theme, and then these are some of the other themes as well that you can also choose from. Once you reference this, so in this case, shows you here how you would reference the theme. Once you reference this within your HTML file, you do not have to also reference that main CSS class. The theme has all of that, and it takes care of it for you. We will show you an example of a different theme besides light or dark towards the end of our presentation. Okay, so with that all said, I'm going to pass things back over to Jose, and he's going to go ahead and get started showing you some demonstrations on how we can go ahead and get a new application up and running.
Thanks, Heather. I know we are all excited to get straight to the code, but we also need to talk about how our app will be written. The samples on our documentation contain all the code for the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript in a single file. This is to make it easier for everyone to see all the code needed for the entire application at once. In our demos, we are separating the files the way web applications normally do. We will keep the CSS files in a separate folder, our JavaScript files in their own folder, and the index.html file in the root directory of the applications. This helps keep your application organized and clutter-free as the number of lines of code in your app grows. The most important part of a mapping application is its map. The map will contain the data, including the base map and its operational layers. The map view and scene view will display a 2D and 3D view of the map instance, so these views provide a way of viewing and interacting with the components of the map. For example, with the map view, we can change the scale or zoom level in which a user views the map, but the data itself will not be modified. These views render the map and its layers, and that is what makes the map visible to the user. The map view will render the map in 2D, while the scene view will render the map in 3D. The app we are making in this presentation will be utilizing the map view, so let's go ahead and get started. Before jumping straight into our demo, I wanted to briefly introduce the new API keys and how we will utilize them with our application. API keys are required to access base maps and location services. These location services are the geocoding, routing service, geo-enrichment, and several others. The base maps we can access are some of the new API key base maps. The list of these base maps is found in the API reference for the map class. Under the properties, we'll go to the base map property. And as you can see, here are the list of all the base maps we can use with the new API keys. And we also have the list of the base maps that do not require any extra configuration at the moment, so we can use these without an API key. To create a new API key, all you need to do is visit your ArcGIS developers dashboard and click New API Key, similar to the screenshot here. You can add or refer to restrict which domains can utilize the key as well. We won't be going into much detail in this presentation, as there's a presentation dedicated towards explaining these new API keys. All we will show in our demo is how to add the key you generated in your application to access some of these cool base maps. Before we view our first application, let's go straight into our code. As mentioned before, this is going to be our folder structure for each demo. We have the files divided into our CSS folder, our JS folder, and our index.html file. So this is what our index.html file is going to look like. We have our style sheet here using the dark red theme. We have our own CSS file where we have our own custom styling. Here we have the JavaScript API version 4.18, and we have our own JavaScript file right here. So this is where all our code will be going. If we look at the body of the HTML file, we will have a div with an ID, a view div. So this div will act as the container for our map view. So we will be loading our map here. If we take a look at the CSS file, notice that the view div's using a height and width of 100%. So the map's going to take up the entire page. Onto our main.js file. The first step is to reference the map and map view modules in our require statement. If you have not memorized by heart the full module names, you can always use the API reference as a cheat sheet. So if you take a look at our documentation, each class will contain the import module string at the top. So if you don't remember what that string is, you can always go back and reference the documentation to grab that. Next, we add the corresponding function parameters for each module. These parameters can have any name you would like to provide, but it makes it easier to keep track if you just keep the name of the parameter the same as the actual class. For instance, this map name, we can use my map, but if we do that here, we have to also make the change wherever we reference the map. So you can name these parameters whatever you like. You just have to remember which goes with which. So it's easier just to keep the same name consistent as your module that you imported. For this demo, we will be demonstrating how to add a base map that requires an API key. So we will need to import the config module. We are naming the config module's corresponding function parameter name as Esri config, as there are a handful of names that may potentially conflict with existing web application variables, and config is one of those variables that could cause some issues. So we just rename it to a unique Esri config. Next, we will use the API key property of the Esri config and assign the API key that we generated from our ArcGIS developers account. Now that we have an API key, we can utilize one of the API key base maps. So I will use the ArcGIS dark gray base map. I would like to mention that the API key used in this demo has been deleted. So you would need to create your own API key and load it into these demos. If you do not have a key or would rather wait to create one later, you can just swap this base map with a different base map that doesn't need the extra configuration. For example, instead of using the ArcGIS dark gray base map, we can just utilize the dark gray base map. So this doesn't require an API key to load. We now move on to the map view, where we set our container to the ID of the div we have in our HTML file, that view div we talked about earlier. We then set an extent on the map view to a region we want to be zoomed to initially on our map. I initially set an extent similar to Los Angeles County in California. We could have easily set a center with specific coordinates and a zoom to a specific level of detail on the base map as well. But I wanted to showcase that we could do something very similar using the extent property and not use the center and zoom. So now let's take a look at our application. Here we have our first map with the base map. Our current extent is the extent we specified on the map view, which is near Los Angeles County. So we can just zoom and pan around the map now. So easy, right? So let's move on to some common mistakes that we usually run into when we first getting started with the API. As you continue to build amazing web applications using the API, there are some common mistakes we all make when we first get started. Number one, we add our modules to use the classes we need in our app, but we forget that in the order in which the modules are placed in the require statement is the same order needed for the function parameters. So let me show you what I mean. I'll go ahead and swap the order of the map and map view function parameters. And we will go back to our application and see what kind of error we see now. So let's go ahead and reload our application. On initial load, we won't see anything, so getting familiar with the browser developer tools will be very helpful to finding most of the issues you run into. Since I'm using a Chrome browser, I will go ahead and go into our settings, more tools, developer tools. And we will be taking a look at our console tab. So normally when we run into issues, we normally see an error in the console tab. But in this example, where the order of the function parameter names don't match the modules, we are not seeing an error. So this is one of the common gotchas that is useful to know, so you're not pulling your hair and trying to find out what the particular issue is if you don't get any error in your console. So we know that the fix for this is just to swap the order of the map and map view, which we modified back to its original position that matches the order of the modules. So that should be map, and we should have the map view. Another common mistake is forgetting to add a module in the first place. I'm guilty of still running into this mistake constantly because I get way too eager to see my code work. I actually ran into this issue while making these demos, so don't worry if you run into this issue because I still do. So for instance, let's say we forgot to add the map view altogether. Now let's go to our application and see what error we can find. So let's go ahead and reload our application. We're going to go to the developer tools once again, more tools, developer tools. And now we see an error in our console. The error we're getting is map view is not defined. This is the error we will receive when we forget to add a module. So if at any point while you're working on your application, you receive an error where a particular class is not defined, it's a big hint that you may not be adding that module in your require statement. The fix would just to simply go back, load our map view module, add that function parameter, and we would be good to go. Finally, another mistake you may run into is forgetting the style sheet to load the CSS from the CDN. For this mistake, the map will still load, but you will notice that the zoom buttons and the attribution at the bottom of the page will be gone. It's easier to remember to load the JavaScript API, but don't forget to load your style sheet as well. Now let's talk about adding your data to the map in the form of a layer. To add data to our maps, we normally use operational layers, and in this demo, we're going to focus on the feature layer. Of course, there are several other layers that you can utilize in your mapping applications, and in order to view some of these other layers, we can go to the documentation and see the list of layers that are supported by the API. As we see here, we can use the map image layer, the CSV layer, GeoJSON layer, vector tile layer, and etc. There are several layers that we can use as operational layers. However, despite there being so many layers, the way we load these layers is the same process. The operational layers are loaded via the module under the Esri layers prefix, followed by the layer type. So in this screenshot, it's the Esri layers followed by the feature layer. We can access and set their properties in the same way as well. These layers can also be loaded whether you are using a map view or a scene view, so 2D or 3D. So the process of adding our operational layers onto our map is similar, and we can access and set their properties similarly as well. The only thing that will vary is the actual properties that are available for each layer. In regards to the available class properties, there are a couple ways to set them. Number one, you can set them individually outside of the class, as we see in the screenshot here. And number two, we can set them within the constructor as you instantiate your class, as we can see in the screenshot example here as well. You do not need to worry about using a get and set methods because you can directly assign new values to certain properties as long as they are not read-only properties. There's a section in the ArcGIS API for JavaScript documentation that talks about the programming patterns, and it goes into some more detail on getting and setting properties. A very useful concept that I personally enjoy using is watching for property changes. The watch method does what its name implies. It watches for property changes of an instance. You can compare it to an event listener that you may have on a button click. Whenever the button is clicked, the event is fired and a callback function will execute each time the button was clicked. This is the same functionality that can be achieved, so you can easily watch for property changes to track changes on the objects you choose. For example, the MapView class contains a scale property. You can watch for changes in the scale, so anytime a user zooms in or out of the map, the callback function for the watch will fire, and you can now see the new scale after a user zoomed into or out of the map. So you can easily add an HTML element to your app where you're displaying the map view's current scale, letting the users know at which current scale they currently are on the map. This screenshot here indicates how we can also watch for a layer's load status property to see when it has finished loading or if it failed to load. We can take advantage of the watch utils class methods to watch for specific property changes, updates, and others as well. We also have a sample where we can see how the watch util methods can be used in your application. So you can take a look at this and use it as reference. Now we move on to our demo to demonstrate how to add data in the form of a feature layer to our application. Before we jump to the demo, I wanted to first give a shout out to the Black Girls Map community for letting us utilize some of their data that we will be using in our demos to showcase the features of the API. If you were not already aware, Black Girls Map is a community-focused group that connects and empowers women of color in the field of GIS and enables marginalized communities to visualize various social issues and empowers these communities with information to help them make informed decisions using GIS. This community is doing some great work, so you can all take a look at the projects they have done and are currently working on. The data we borrowed is a service containing Black-owned business locations in the United States. The community already has their own application to showcase this, Black Businesses California application. We are building our own unique version that highlights the features of the ArcGIS API for JavaScript in our demos. So thanks again to Black Girls Map. And now let's go ahead and load this data that we borrowed into our application. In order to add our feature layer to our application, the first step we're going to do is to add the feature layer module to our require statement. We will add its corresponding function parameter as well. Next, we're going to initialize our feature layer. We're going to provide a title for the layer. We're going to assign the URL variable that contains the service URL to our data in our constructor. Next, we will use the map layers property to add the feature layer to our map, and that is it. Let's go back and take a look at our application now. This is our application now with our data in the form of a feature layer added to our map. So the data actually is part of the entire United States, but since we're focusing mainly on the extent assigned on the map view of the Los Angeles region. Now we will pass it along to Heather as she's going to show us how to configure a pop-up template to our feature layer and display that in our app. So passing it over to you now, Heather.
Great. So now that Jose showed you how to add base map, work with API keys, and add a feature layer as an operational layer on top of your base map, we're going to go ahead and show you how you can add some interaction, some user interaction with your data in your map. We're going to do this through the use of pop-ups. Basically, what all pop-up does is, just like it says here, it just responds to your mouse click. So you click on a specific feature, and based upon that feature you click on, it can provide you information specific to that feature, maybe some underlying attribute data. It can also provide information, just specific content that you set within that pop-up itself. So there's a couple different ways of actually doing this. You can get, like it says, you can get the information directly within your feature attributes. You can get maybe the location of the feature, so that returned coordinate location. Maybe you'd want to get that X and Y. You can get that. You can get that returned back within a pop-up. Search results. So if you're working maybe with like the search widget, you type in an area or a specific feature that you want to search for. That search result that you get can also go ahead and be selected with an associated pop-up as well. All the pop-ups, the pop-ups that you create, they are customizable. We will go into a little bit of detail and show you how to do this. I actually am doing another demo theater with my colleague Kelly, and we're going to talk about specifically customizing pop-ups and some of the different things that you can do with it. We're not going to go into all of that within this particular session, but just know that that information is out there. So there are a few different ways of working with the content within that pop-up and setting and accessing the pop-up. The first thing to remember is that every view has a default instance of your pop-up. So in our particular case, we're working with the map, so we have our map view has that pop-up property instance directly off of it that we can get access to. The feature layer also has an associated pop-up template property. Pop-up template's actually really nice because it allows you to go in and configure how you want the pop-up to display based upon, whether you want to show maybe some of the attributes in, specific field formats. Maybe you want to show some data. It's data-driven, so you want to show some charts within your pop-up. You can show images, attachments. You can even customize it too, based upon, mix and match and different types of elements that you want to have within the actual pop-up. So if we take a look at the pop-up in the API reference, you'll see here that it gives us a reference to actually what we're in the view. So we have the pop-up property within the view class. And then from there, you'll notice here that we can go in, and within that pop-up, you should be able to get access to all of the properties and so forth off of it that you need. The pop-up template is where you're probably going to go in if you're working, specifically if you're working with data, like feature layer data that you want to show within your application. this is where you would go in and specify and set the configuration for how you want to have this displayed. So the main thing to remember when working with a pop-up template, we're not going to go into all of it, mainly just because there's a lot of information in here. But the main thing to consider or to keep in mind when working with this is that you can set your pop-up template. The content is where you're going to be setting all of how you want this to display. So you can specifically set it directly in the content itself, just maybe as just straight HTML, or what you could do, and probably what I find to be a little bit more easier to manage, at least when you're writing your code, is to break it out into separate elements. So basically, you can work with attachments, you can work with fields, media such as charts and images, text, and you can also create your own custom content too, which is it's a newer way of handling it. Basically allows you to go in and kind of like mix and match, and I can show you, or I will show you in a moment here, where you can access a bunch of different samples that show you different ways of working with the pop-up content. But basically what you would need to do is really going to be dependent upon the data that you're working with and how you want to display this within your application. So in this case, if you just go to the sample code and take a look on the left-hand side, you will notice here that we have a section specifically that deals with pop-ups. We start you off with an intro and work your way on down here with various types of scenarios with what you may want to do with your pop-up. And then lastly, another thing to keep in mind is that we do allow you the ability to position the pop-up as well. So we have a doc options property off of the pop-up class, and you can set that within the pop-up. So you can tell it, hey, I want this to be docked only in this particular part or location of your application. I don't want it to be docked at all. Like, I want it to be floating based upon where I click. I want that pop-up to show where I click. And again, we have samples that show how to do all of that. So I am going to show you a very quick demo and basically take the existing app that Jose created. And now, in addition to having that feature layer, we're also going to go ahead and show how to create a pop-up on top of that. So I'm going to go in here, and like we mentioned at the very, very beginning, we're going to give you a lot of information in this session. But with that being said, we also have all of the demos and these slides provided in my GitHub repo, so you can, at your own leisure, go in and play around with things and just kind of get yourself a little bit more familiarized with how all of this works. Okay, so we have Southern California, Los Angeles. We're going to click on one of these locations, and we can see here that I get a pop-up that comes up. The way that I formatted this pop-up is based on some information stored within my feature layer. So I've got some address information and I have the industry that it is. I also have a field that provides the website for this particular business. There are multiple features that I clicked on, actually, since I'm zoomed out pretty far. So you can see here that I actually have 6 that hit test. Basically, it's a tolerance, it's a hit test. It grabs where you click on it, and anything that falls within that tolerance is going to show up. So we've got 6 here. So if we take a look, I'm going to go to the code behind this and open up that JavaScript file. And what you can see here is I just have a reference to this feature layer. So everything here that Jose added earlier. But now what we're doing is in addition to that, we are also creating a new reference to a pop-up template. In this pop-up template, we're passing in the reference to the name. So this is an actual field. The field the field within that layer is called name. If we were not sure, all we would do, just go in here, take a look at the layer of the service, and we can take a look at the fields. And in here, I should have a name field, and I do. It's right there. So we're going to take a look at, we're going to go ahead and set the title of that pop-up to the name of that business. And here, since this is editable data, that's a word, this is editable data, what happens is there is a field in there that actually will show you, by default, it's set to true, that's going to show you when that feature was last edited. I don't really care in this particular case to know when that was, so I can set this to false. And this is where I actually specify or pass in the content to what we want to display within our pop-up. So remember how I mentioned before, we have different types of elements. So I'm going to be, in this particular one, I am working with our fields. So I am going to show two fields. I'm going to show the address field and the type of industry that it is. And then I'm also going to show just a basic text element. Okay, and in this case, I'm actually working with text that also has an arcade expression on top of it. So basically a little bit of logic that goes in, and it's checking to see whether or not the field that we have, if there's a website field in this layer, if that website field actually has a valid website, then go ahead and show it. We're not going to go into detail on how arcade and expressions work within this particular session. There are plenty of others that are going to be provided with this Developer Summit and recorded that you can go back in and get additional information on. We do have a lot of good tutorials that talk about all of this as well within our SDK. So the main thing to keep in mind here is I have a text element and I have two fields. And then lastly, what I'm doing is I'm passing in the template that I just created here, and I'm passing that in to my feature layers pop-up template. Once I do that, I can now go in here and click on one of these features. Based upon what I click on, it's going to go take, specify that content. So what I have set within that template, so I had two fields, the address and the industry, and then show me, and in this case, it does have an associated website with this particular feature. So it's going to go ahead and show that. I can click on that, and it should bring up the page for that restaurant. Okay. All right. So we talked a little bit about pop-ups. Now we're going to talk a little bit about widgets. So when you hear the word widget, basically all it means is that it's a bit of functionality that's just encapsulated. So earlier I mentioned the search widget. That is search functionality for your application that's encapsulated within with this specific widget class. You might have a directions. We've got the search. We have the legend widget. We've got a feature table widget. So there's a bunch of different widgets that you can work with based upon what you actually need, the functionality that you need within your application. Here are just a few of them. So again, like your editor. When I was saying geocode, that's like your locate. Pop-ups. So pop-up technically is a widget. So in this particular case, what we're going to do is, I'm going to show you a really quick demo, but one of the main thing as well, and this is kind of something that we reiterate throughout this session, is that regardless, just kind of like what Jose was saying earlier, regardless of what type of layer it is that you're using, the pattern for working with the layers and loading the layers is always going to be the same. Same premise goes when working with widgets. It doesn't matter what widget it is that you're working with, the coding pattern of working with the widgets is pretty much going to be very similar across the board. So mainly what that's going to be is you're going to create, or you're going to require the reference to it, instantiate, so create a new reference to it. So in this case, we have a legend. You're going to want to pass in these the appropriate properties that are needed to work with it. So for the most case, usually you're going to need to have a view, so it needs to know what view that widget is associated with. And then in this particular case, we need to tell it, hey, what DOM node, like what the container, which is this div, what are we going to associate? Where is this legend going to be associated with, and where is it going to be, how is it going to be handled within that HTML? So we pass in that container. So what we have here is just basically a legend. We also have an expand widget, which allows you to minimize and maximize to show various amounts of widgets within like a broader container. And then on top of it, what we have is the view has, you can work off the view UI. And basically what that does is it's just an easy way of allowing you as the developer to, like it says here, just adding and removing, moving widgets around. It makes it a lot easier. I don't know, I'm kind of dating myself here, but if you worked in prior versions back in 3, we didn't have this. It was a little bit harder to do that. So here in the ArcGIS API, in this particular case, all we're having to do is just say like, hey, view UI add, pass in the name of the widget that you're adding, and then where you want that widget to be located within your application. So we're going to go ahead. I'm going to show you a very quick demo on how to add widgets to that existing applications or to that application that I just showed you. So in this particular case, we have, it's very large because I blew up my, I made my screen a little bit larger here, but we have the expand widget, and by default, I have it set to automatically be opened when I open up my application. So this is the expand widget right here in the upper right. So if it's right now, it's expanded, I can collapse it. So if I don't want to see things, open that up. And what I'm seeing here right now is just a legend. So this legend is associated with the view. And in that legend, I have the correct feature layers that I want to have displayed based upon what is in my application. So again, if we just take a quick look at that code behind this, what you're going to see here is I've added a couple additional classes reference to these. So I've got the Esri widgets, legend, and expand. Okay. So again, I'm just adding on to the existing code that we already had prior to this. So we have our pop-ups, got our feature layer. In addition to that, what we're going to do here towards the end is we're going to add this legend and add that expand widget. So we're going to create a new reference to a legend. We're going to pass in a reference to our view. And it's going to take all of the layers and everything that we have associated within that map within this view. We're going to tell it, hey, I want you to set the legend in this div that I've had set up outside of this called legend div. And then in addition to that, what I'm also going to do here is I am going to create an expand widget, basically setting the same type of properties here. I also want it to be automatically expanded by default. And then lastly, I need to add that widget to the view. So remember how I said before that the steps pretty much are going to remain the same. You instantiate it, you set the properties, and then you need to make sure that you add that widget to whatever location it is that you need within your view. So we are setting the expand widget to the top right, and that expand widget already is going to have a reference to that legend. All right, so I've talked enough. I'm going to go ahead and pass it over now to Jose, where he is going to talk a bit more about querying the data.
Thank you, Heather. So let's now talk about renders. A render defines how to visually represent each feature in a layer. It helps the user get more information visually out of the data they are seeing on the map without having to know the attribute information for each feature. There are several types of renders available, from the unique value render, class breaks render, heat map render, as well as a few others. Each layer that is published as a service contains its own default render. So the layers in the API, whether it's feature layer, map image layer, etc., will contain a render property that contains the drawing information for the layer. If you don't believe me, let's go ahead and take a look at the service URL for the point layer we added to our map. So as we can see, the layer has its drawing info where we can see the render. And in this case, it's using a simple render. And the symbol that is using is a Esri picture marker symbol. That's what the Esri PMS means. So the symbol for each point in this layer is using an image. And we can see that image URL here as well. We can override the default render of a layer by assigning the render property, the new render we created in our code. For instance, the screenshot below demonstrates how we can create a new unique value renderer and assign it directly to a feature layer. This screen capture demonstrates an empty constructor, but in our demo, we will demonstrate how to set up a unique value renderer ourselves to visualize our point data differently. Each renderer contains its own symbol. For instance, the point layer we just looked at contained a simple render with a picture marker symbol as its symbol. The symbols for each renderer will also depend on whether the geometry of the features in the layer are point, polylines, or polygons. We cannot use a picture marker symbol to symbolize a polyline, and vice versa, we cannot symbolize a point with a polyline symbol. The renderer also has a visual variables property that allows a feature symbol's size, color, opacity, and rotation to change depending on the field value specified for each feature. For instance, in the screenshot below, we're utilizing the size visual variable, and the field we're using is the wind speed. So the size of the symbol for this particular features will depend on the wind speed field of the feature. If you would like to learn how to use visual variables in your application, the following documentation will be very useful, as well as some of our sample applications that we have for visual variables as well. So this next feature of the API, autocasting, is not specific to rendering and symbols. This is a concept and feature that's available for the entire API and its properties. So autocasting is used to cast JavaScript objects as ArcGIS API for JavaScript class types, without the need for these classes to be loaded in the require. This is helpful to reduce the amount of code you write, and I will be showing you an example of autocasting in our next demo as we autocast the unique value render. If you are not sure which properties can be autocasted, you can just take a look at the documentation and look to see if there's an autocast tag for the property you are looking at. You can read more about autocasting from the documentation page in the programming patterns, but we will also get our hands dirty and utilize this in our next demo. So for instance, here we have an example of code that we normally would write to import each individual module that we're going to be using in our code. And now we see how the amount of code that we reduce by using autocasting. So all we have to do is actually just import the feature layer. So again, we're just going to show an example in our next demo. Now let's go ahead and add the unique value render to our feature layer. As we can see here, we are taking advantage of the autocasting feature to initialize our unique value render without having to import the unique value render module in our require statement. All we have to do is create a JavaScript object, assign the unique value type, and add some of the properties that we would like to specify that are part of our unique value render. The unique value render allows you to symbolize features in a layer based on one or more matching attribute values from a specified field. The features with similar values will be represented with unique colors, fill styles, or images. We need to specify the field we will be using in the field property. In this case, we're going to be using the industry field. Each type and its associated symbol must also be defined using the unique value infos property. We first set our default symbol so that any feature with an industry field value that we do not specify in our unique value infos property will default to the simple marker symbol with the light gray color. So here we are specifying the field values with their corresponding symbols. So we're going to be taking care of features that have an industry field value of accessories and clothing, arts and culture, auto, food and beverage, and so on. We're also adding a label to display in our legend widget that Heather showed us how to add. These are just some of the field values that we're going to be accounting for. So now let's directly assign a render to our feature layer render property right here. And now that that's done, let's take a look at our application now with our render applied. This is our application now with the unique value render applied. As you can see, by using the legend and the symbology of the points in this layer, we can already identify which features correspond with a particular industry. This gives the user valuable information immediately without having to interact with the map and its features. We will now move on to client-side filtering to be able to filter out the points that we want to just focus on in our application. So let's learn about filtering data. We can achieve client-side filtering using the feature filter. And the feature filter defines parameters for setting a client-side filter on a layer view. And the layer view represents the view for a single layer after it has been added to either the map view or a scene view. With the layer view, the features it displays will be stored on the client side. So any filters or queries to it will not require a server request, which could additionally improve some performance. You can set filters by attributes, time, geometry, and geometry with distance. Only the features that meet the requirements specified in the filter will be displayed. So let's jump to our code to see how we can add client-side filtering to our application. Let's take a look at the HTML file. And I went ahead and added a select element or dropdown. Each option in the dropdown represents one of the field attribute values from the unique value infos we specified. We have accessories and clothing, arts and culture, food and beverage, and etc. This is the dropdown we will utilize to select the features we want to filter and view on our map. Now let's go to our JavaScript file. So in order to access our layer view, we utilize the view.whenLayerView method. So whenever the callback function here gets called, we will have access to that layer view. We added an event listener on the select element. So anytime a user changes the option in the dropdown, this event will be fired and the following callback function will be called. For the layer view filter down here, we will utilize the where property to filter the features based off a SQL query expression we generate. In the first if statement, we check if a user selected the all option, which has a value of 1 is equal to 1. This means that all the features will be displayed. Next, we check if the other option is selected. So that means the features that are not specified by the dropdown options will be the only ones that appear. This SQL expression is generated from the generate other SQL string function that we created down here. We won't focus on how this code is done, but you can review the code on your own time. Finally, if a user selects one of the specified options, the SQL expression will return only the features with the particular industry field value. That is all we need to achieve client-side filtering. So just to summarize, we needed the layer view to filter out its features on the client side. With the SQL expression, we set on its filters where property. This is now our application with client-side filtering. If we take a look at our dropdown, we can filter by specific industries, accessories and clothing, arts and culture, and we're only seeing the features that satisfy the query we set on our layer view. So to prove that client-side filtering does not send additional requests to the server, I will open up the developer tools and go to the network tab. Here, we can monitor the server requests that our application sends out. Notice that there are no server requests to the service to fetch any features after each filter we perform. To show this network tab is working, I will zoom into the map so we can see the app fetch some base map tiles. We are almost done with our application. Thank you for hanging out with us this long. Let me pass it over one more time to Heather so she can show us how to add a feature table to this app and finalize it. Over to you, Heather.
Great. So I'm going to finish up here and briefly touch upon just one more widget. We talked a little bit about how widgets work. They all pretty much follow the same basic steps when working with widgets. Instantiating it, setting properties, adding it to the view. In this particular case, we're going to work with our feature table. The feature table, it's not new. It's a relatively newer widget, I would say. We are constantly improving and working on it. It's got a lot to it, let's just say. But what the feature table actually does is it provides us, or it provides the audience a way, the audience of your application, it provides them a way of viewing the attribute information of the feature layers that you're working, or the features within your feature layers that you're working with within a tabular or table, like tabular format. So if we take a quick look here, I have just a very basic demo. And again, it's the same exact one. We're just building upon it. We have this feature layer that was just, we have a render now and everything set on it. In addition to that, though, we have added the feature table widget. So this widget is basically what we're seeing here on the bottom of the screen within this application. Okay. So what we have is when I set up or passed in the properties for this feature table, you can specify and just say, hey, I want you to take this entire layer, and it will bring in basically all the fields. Or you can configure that and make it so that it only shows specific fields that you set within the feature table's properties. So in this case, I am showing, I want to see the business name, I want to see the address, perhaps maybe the website, industry, and then the phone number. I do have the ability to go in here. I can sort the names ascending or descending. In addition to that, I can go in here and I can show specific columns or hide them. Yeah. All right, so very, very basic. If I go in here, let's just say I click on one of these guys, you'll notice here that it automatically will go in and select the associated feature that I selected or checked on here within the feature table. One thing, let's go ahead and I'll just show you the underlying code. It'll make things a little bit easier. Alrighty, make that a little bit bigger. Okay, so we're adding the feature table. So we have that feature table there, getting a reference. And then here, when that view is ready, we are going to create a new instance of that feature table, pass in a reference to the layer, and then here, this is where I am specifying what fields it is, because I don't want to see all of them. There was quite a few, and I don't need all of that in there. So I'm only telling it, hey, I want to see a few of these fields. And then I'm going to set the container. So I'm telling it where I want this table div to be displayed within my application. One thing to keep in mind, and this is important, is that you need to make sure that you set the view within the properties. Some widgets, I generally like to do it if the view is there. You should associate it. Not all have that, but in this particular case, if you do not set the view, that feature highlight will not work because it's not going to know how to associate that selected feature, which view it needs to pass that selection to. So what we're doing is we're calling we're listening for the selection change event on that feature table, and when it calls that, we're going to go in and we're going to zoom to those selected features. And that's basically it. There is more that you can do with it. Again, I don't know if you noticed or not, I had a pop-up earlier that if you click on this, you can actually wire it up so that if you click on a pop-up, you can have that associated feature, the record, show up as selected within your feature table. We do have a sample within our SDK that actually shows how to do that. If you go to the sample code and go to pop-ups and feature table widget with pop-up interaction, this will show you how you can go in and basically toggle between the two. Click on one and it will have the associated row within the feature table selected as well. Okay, so we just gave you guys a ton of information, and I know that's a lot to process all within 1 hour. You're probably going to have a lot more questions as time goes on, so thing to keep in mind is where can you get additional information later on down the line. If anything that you get from this, hopefully just remember, please bookmark that SDK documentation because that is going to be where you're going to go to basically find your samples to get basic conceptual types of questions answered and any of your API reference information, properties, the members of it, methods, events, and so forth. We have related trainings and webinars, so go in, it's all listed. We'll have everything there. We have that, especially now in the days of COVID, everything is online. So please just keep track of what we have within on Esri.com. We do have, just outside of us, there are online training, some free, some not so free for just basic JavaScript. And then lastly, and this is, I can't stress how really useful these forums are. We have the GeoNet forum, which is ours, the Esri one, and this is where basically people will come in and just ask basic questions like, hey, I'm trying to do this, I'm not quite sure, maybe you can post some code, someone will come in there and help you out. Maybe sometimes people just come in and they just like to show off a little bit of some of the really cool things that they've made, and that's great too. I go in occasionally, we'll check things out, see maybe, sometimes we'll find bugs, things that were, maybe something that we just didn't catch in a release. And a user like yourself may go in here, find it, say, hey, I'm not sure if this is supposed to be acting this way. Is this a problem? Is this a bug? Sure enough, this is also a good place. Generally, we like people to go through support for that type of stuff, but a lot of times we'll see issues pop up here too as well, and that's fine. So definitely just make sure, take note that there is the communities page where you can go in here and get some of your questions answered. The Stack Exchange, that's just in general, you can Google something, and Stack Exchange is generally one of the first things that pop up. You've got the spatial community in Slack. So there's a lot of different places where you can get some additional information if you run into some issues. So we gave you a lot of info. We really appreciate your time. If you don't mind, please provide any feedback that you have for this session. There should be a link below this. Again, we appreciate it, and hopefully we can see you guys in person real soon. Thanks.